So today's daf we're going to learn is Eruvin daf Yudalid. Today's daf we finished yesterday's very interesting daf about Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim Chayim. Although today's daf is going to make some reference to what we learned yesterday in a few different areas. We'll see. We're going to start quickly review the Mishnah. So I'll review it in a few brief words. We saw the width of the korah has to be strong enough in order to have a brick put on it. The brick is 1.5 by 3 because the brick is 3 by 3 and half of that is 1.5 by 3. Then we said it, but it only has to be a tefach. The Gemara is going to ask right away, why not a tefach and a half if it needs to include that? And then we have the Rabbi Yehuda says, so Tanakama says it has to be strong, even to hold, that it could technically hold the brick. And then we see that Rabbi Yehuda says, no, even if it's not strong, we can view it as if it's strong enough. Okay, so therefore, if it's made of a reed, if it were to be metal in the same size and that would work, then that would be sufficient. Then we said, one second, I just want to, okay. Then we said that, then we have this fascinating thing at the end. We have the akuma. We'll get to that, exactly what that is in the Gemara. And then we have the round. Okay, round, we said, ki'ilu hi merubat. You view it as if it's a square. And how do you measure? So let's say it's a round beam. We say if the circumference is 3, that means the diameter is 1. And then we're going to have a whole interesting thing. The Mishnah specifically tells you that's the measurement. Now, even though we know that's not the measurement, because we know it's pi, we're going to have to see why did the rabbis say this and how do we relate to it? And today is going to be a lot of a mathematical, we're going to see, what's very interesting is how the rabbis did their mathematics, okay? Now, whether they either were not so adept at mathematics is one possibility, or they were very adept at mathematics, but they knew that the average person wasn't going to be so adept at mathematics, and they tried to simplify it. And this happens in a lot of halacha, not necessarily when it comes to math, but in terms of lots of areas where they want to simplify so that the average person can understand and follow. Okay, so we'll get to this throughout the Gemara. So starting at the top of your dalet, tefach. So why is it a tefach? If it has to hold this brick, it should be tefach v'mechtzavai. It should be 1.5. So they say, well, kevan dirachav tefach lekabel tefach ida chatzi tefach mabin lebetina mashu mehayisa umashu mehayisa. So as long as it can hold the brick, it can support it, and then the extra quarter of a tefach on either side, they fill in with cement to cement it into place. That's one possibility, that you actually have to put the cement in. But then they say, no, well, most people understand, no, since you're actually not even holding the brick there, it's just that theoretically, if you put the brick on top, you put a little cement from here and a little cement there, and that would be sufficient. So, okay, now, Amarava bar Rav Huna, Korah she'amru tzricha shetei bri'ah kedei lekabel ariach. So now Rav Huna said this beam has to be strong in order to accept a brick. So now they say, but ma'amidei korah einan tzrichin shubrim kedei lekabel korah. But the support of the beams, okay, meaning what probably this means is, think about when you put up a beam. You could either just put the beam on top of the wall, and maybe it means that the walls need to be strong enough that if you were to put a brick on top of the beam, which was on top of the walls have to be strong enough to be able to support it. Alternatively, you could say that the ma'amidim are the same way you have on bookshelves. You have little pieces that support the bookshelf in place. So probably when they put up this korah, they needed a support underneath. That support, according to this, doesn't need to be strong enough that if you, remember, this is all theoretically, you could put the brick on top of the beam. So the beam has to support the brick, but the supports for the beam, if they wouldn't support a brick, let's say you would put the brick on the beam and the beam is on the supports, so you would break through the supports, maybe that would be a problem. So they say, well, you don't have to worry about that. The support beam of the beams don't need to be strong enough, which really is basically saying this whole thing is theoretical, that theoretically the beam has to be strong enough to hold a brick. And this all goes back to, what did we say? The beam, okay, more so than the lechi, is mishum heker, has to be noticeable. Something noticeable has to be something significant. Significant means significant enough that it could hold a brick. But the pieces underneath, we don't really care so much. That's not really significant. So now they say, Rav Chisda Amar, he disagrees, and he says, Echad zeh v'echad zeh tzrichin shiyu bri'in. Both of these need to be enough to support. In other words, this has to be a real thing. It has to be that you really could put a brick on top, which means also the supports need to be able to support it. Kedei lekabel korah va'ariach. In other words, the supports need to be able to be strong enough to hold the beam and to hold a brick on top of the beam. So those are two opinions about what we do. Amar Rav Sheshet, hiniach korah al gabei mavoi, uparas alea machzelet, v'igbiya min hakarka shlosha, korah ein kan, mechitza ein kan. He says, what if you have a beam, and on top of that you put a machzelet, a mat, and you hang it hanging down. So he says, if the mat hanging down doesn't reach within 3 handbreadths of the ground, you don't have a beam, and you don't have a wall, okay? Because the machzelet theoretically could be making a mechitza. However, what's the problem with this mechitza? It doesn't hit the ground. What's the problem with the beam? We'll see in a second. Korah ein kan dehamikasya. It's covered. You can't see the beam. All you see is a mat hanging down. Now, a mat can only function as mechitza. This mat doesn't function as a mechitza because it's not within 3 tvachim of the ground. A mechitza, we learned already. Remember, mechitza tluya doesn't work. The mechitza is hanging. That doesn't work. It has to be up until the ground, and we're going to see why in a minute. It only works, remember, we allowed it only to draw water, then we allowed a mechitza tluya, but otherwise a hanging mechitza doesn't work, and we'll see why. So a beam doesn't work because you can't see it, and the machzelet doesn't work. Mechitza ein kan dehavile mechitza shagdiyim bokim bo. Why is 3 tvachim the number that we give, 3 handbreadths? Because a gedi, a little goat, he can basically break through and get through underneath this mechitza, this wall. So therefore, that's always the shiur. This comes up also by sukkah. It's the same thing. Tanu Rabbanan, korah hayotzeit mikotel zeh ve'ein hanogat bekotel zeh. We're now going to have a whole bunch of beams that don't fully work. Okay, what's going to be the issue with them? So one is a beam that goes across and doesn't end at the other wall. Generally, the beam has to go from wall to wall. Doesn't reach the other wall. Or you have one beam coming out of one beam coming out of the other. For this, we have pictures. Okay, this is picture number, actually, no, this one, there's no picture. Sorry, my mistake. So you have beams coming out of both walls with a space in between. Okay, they don't reach each other. So if that's the case, if it's less than 3, then you don't need to bring another beam. But if it's already more than 3, again, this is all the din of levud. That we view this as if it's less than 3, everything is kind of one line. If it's more than 3, then already we can't view them as joining together. And then, if you remember, we had Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. He has a different approach to levud. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omer pachot mi-arba'a ein tzarich lavi korah acheret. Arba'a tzarich lavi korah acheret. For him, levud is 4 handbreadths. V'chein shtei korot hamatimot. If you have 2 parallel beams, lo bezo lekabel ariach v'lo bezo kedei lekabel ariach. This is picture number 102. If you have these 2, each one on their own is not the thickness of a tefach, but together they can hold an ariach. There's a debate about what this means. Some people say it means that together they both have a tefach, meaning half a tefach, and together they make a tefach. Or some people say that it's that they're each narrow, but together, think about it, when you're putting up a picture hook, if you put one in the middle, it's not necessarily strong enough. If you put 2 of the same, right, you put 2 smaller ones on the sides, that can support it better. So theoretically, you could have 2 smaller ones that don't actually add up to a tefach, but if together you can put a brick on it, then it would work. So if they could do it, im kablim ariach lerochbo tefach, ein tzarich lavi korah acheret. V'im lav, then you need to bring a new one. Rashbag disagrees here also and says, im mekabelet ariach leorko shlosha ein tzarich lavi korah acheret. It needs to be that you can put 3, the lengthwise, not the 1.5 part on the one, but on the 2 beams, you put the brick the other direction, its length, okay, the 3 tvachim part. If that can fit on both of them, then it would work. Okay. Next case. Korah. Okay. Hayu echat lemala. We're a little bit past the midpoint of the daf. Hayu echat lemala ve'echat lemata. What if one was higher and one was lower? Okay, this is picture number 103. You might not be able to see here from picture, but one is lower down than the other. Okay, so now what do we say? If one is lower than the other, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Remember, now we're going to pay attention. This is Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. We're going to relate back to this in another minute. Ro'in et ha'elyona ki'ilu hi lamata, ve'et ha'tachtona ki'ilu hi lamala. We kind of view these both as if they're together. Okay, so we can join them, even though they're not next to each other. We view it as if they're next to each other. Okay, and then the question becomes, our question always, right? As long as the two of them together have a tefach, then it'll work. Ubevad shelo tehei elyona lamala me'asrim ama v'tachtona lamata me'asara. But it has to be within our generally accepted opinions about what's the measurement. Is it right higher than 10 handbreadths, lower than 20 cubits? So it has to be within that. So now they say, very interestingly, Amar Abaye, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, savar la kavua b'chada, upalag alei b'chada. He agreed with his father, Rabbi Yehuda, about one thing and disagreed with him about something else. Now, if you look at the Mishnayot we learned, what do we have? Savar la kavua b'chada di le'roin. In our Mishnah, what did Rabbi Yehuda say? That if it's not healthy enough, right, it's not strong enough, we view it as if it's metal. And then we can say it's strong enough. Or if it would be strong enough as metal, then it's strong enough. That's this concept of rowing. We kind of have this imagination. We can view it as something that it's actually not. Likewise here, they're not together. We can view them as if they're together. But palagale bechada, what does he disagree with Rabbi Yehuda? Remember Rabbi Yehuda from the first Mishnah? The ilu Rabbi Yehuda savar lemala me'aslim. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda savar b'toch aslim in lemala me'aslim lo. Remember Rabbi Yehuda said it can be even above 20 amot. He doesn't care. And here, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, it has to be within 20. So it's interesting that he held by his father about one, but didn't hold like him in the other. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Now we're going to get to this line about Rabbi Yehuda, and we're going to learn that there were different variations. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rechava afa pi she'ena bria. Ma'ne la Rabbi Yehuda lechia bar Rav, kamei de Rav. Rabbi Yehuda taught, not Rabbi Yehuda, this is Rav Yehuda, the Amora, taught Techia bar Rav in front of Rav the following version. Rechava afa pi she'ena bria. Amar le, Rav says to him, Atniye rechava ubria. This, by the way, is very interesting. It's interesting in terms of this Masechet. We already saw that Rav had different versions of the Mishnah. Remember with the wider than 10, he had this opinion that sarich lima'et, right, even though it has a tzurat petach. So that Rav had different versions of these Mishnayot for some reason. So he says, I don't like your version of the Mishnah. My version says that Rabbi Yehuda needs it to be rechava ubria, which means that Rabbi Yehuda agrees with Tanakama, which then means that you don't really have the next line of the Mishnah about the kash and the kanim. That's one way of reading it. Another way of reading it is that Rav had the opposite, that Tanakama says rowing, and Rabbi Yehuda doesn't say rowing, and that Rabbi Yehuda thinks it has to be strong, and that the opinions are switched. V'ha'amar Rabbi Eli, but then they say, but didn't Rabbi Eli say Amarav in the name of Rav? Rechava arba'a afa pi she'ena bria. It has, if it's 4 wide, that's fine, even if it's not bria. So how could Rav say that his version, now this matches a little bit more, if he says there's actually no machloket and everyone agrees that it has to be strong. So here it says, if it's 4, it doesn't need to be strong. So the Gemara answers, Rechava arba'a shani. Once it's 4 tfachim wide, then already it doesn't need to be strong enough. There's the width that kind of overpowers and becomes more important than how strong it is. But if it's only a tefach, then it needs to be strong, according to Rav. So this is the same thing we saw about the pasei chatzer, that if they're not 4, then you need on both sides. But if they're 4, according to some people, you could actually put it up only on one side. So once you jump to 4, it already allows other leniencies. But if you're not yet at 4, then you can't have all those leniencies. Now they say if it was straw, so they say, my kamash malan. What are you trying to teach us? Damrina, rowing? Right? What do you want to say? That we view it as if it's strong, but hainu hach, that's already what he said. He said, even though it's not strong. So why do you need to tell us this? So they say, ma'u detema bimina amrinan, shelo bimina lo amrinan kamash malan. You might have thought that, let's say it's a weak piece of wood. So we'd have to say, ro'in, that if it was a strong piece of wood, it would be fine. But they say, no, this goes even farther to say that you could view it as if it's a different material altogether. And even that is allowed, and that's the chidush. Akuma ho'inota ki'ilu hi pshuta. So pshita, they say, what do you mean? This is obvious. Because their assumption here is that where it goes out, okay, kind of juts out or off the straight path, we're talking about within 3 tvachim, okay, in a space of less than 3 tvachim, and then we say levud. We view this as if it's straight. So why do you need to tell us? So they say, Kid Rabbi Zera, the Amar Rabbi Zera, he betoch hamavoy. We're now up to the where the lines get wide on Yudalad Amud Aleph. The Amar Rabbi Zera, he betoch hamavoy va'akmimuta chutz lamavoy. He betoch 20 va'akmimuta lamala me-20. He lamala me-10 va'akmimuta lamata me-10. רואים כל שאילו ינטל אקמימותה, ואין בין זה לזה שלושה, אין צריך להביא קורה אחרת, ואם לאו צריך להביא קורה אחרת. What do we have here? It's talking about where the part where it juts out is not just that it's not straight, the issue is that it juts out into a space that's forbidden. Under 10, over 20, outside into the public domain, one of those. So then they say, and what's the halacha? Again, levud. If that whole area where it juts out, there's less than 3 tvachim of space between where the beam is straight to the other side where the beam is straight, then it works. If not, it doesn't work. So the Gemara says, hanami pshita, but that's also obvious. Because again, you say din levud, we view this as if it's straight. So what's the difference if it goes out or not? So now they say, there's one case where maybe we would think something else. What's that case? And this is picture number 104. If the part where it's, okay, they have it as a curve. It curves outward. Okay, I don't know if you can see so up in the picture, but it curves outward into the public domain. Now, what might you think? You might think, you might think that someone, right, let's say here's your beam. You know you can carry up to the beam. Well, if the beam juts out in a curved way, you might think that you can walk out into that space, even though it's in the public domain. So this might actually be a problem. Comes the Mishnah to teach you, that's not a problem either, okay? We basically view the beam as if it goes across. We're not worried someone's going to go out into the public domain, which is interesting because you would think, since the beam is a heker, it kind of looks that way, but as long as we can say din levud, we view this beam as if it's solid, and therefore whatever's outside is irrelevant to us. Now we get to our interesting mathematical equations. Why are they telling us this? Okay, it seems like you could figure this out on your own, maybe. So, they really want to tell you this for the last line. The last line is very important. They want to tell you that the measurement always used is, and we'll see the way the Rambam understands this later, is if the circumference is 3, then we assume the diameter is 1. Okay. Where do you get this from? Okay, now, normally you might say mathematical equation, we figured it out. No. Where did the rabbis learn these kinds of things from? Psukim. Okay, that's where they learn things. Amar, we've seen this a number of times before. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kra. The pasuk says, now we're going to learn about something called the Yam Shel Shlomo. I'll show you a picture in the Koran. Very nice picture. It was this basin. There's these animals around it. I think it's cows. I don't remember exactly, but there's this big basin, and it's something that the Kohanim used, that Shlomo HaMelech built, this huge basin. We're going to see it's the size of 150 mikvahs, a minimum size of a mikvah, okay? 150 times that amount that the Kohanim used for washing, okay? They would use it as a mikvah. So now, it was like a huge bowl, okay? So here's the description of it in Sefer Melachim. Vayas et hayam mutzak eser ba'ama. Okay, it was molten. It was eser ba'ama misfato ad sfato, from one tip to the other. That means diameter. It was 10 cubits. Agol saviv. It was round. Bechamesh ba'ama komato, 5 amot high. Vikav shloshim ba'ama yisovev oto saviv. And the circumference of it was 30. Okay, so 10 diameter, 30 circumference. There you have it. So first the Gemara says, wait a minute, ha'ika sfato, but there's the rim. In other words, it sounded like from the inner part of the rim to the other side was 10, which means if you measure from the outside of the rim, which is where the circumference is measured from, it should be actually more than 10, which is funny because that's the opposite, right? We should have it less than 10 if we're going to use 3.14, etc. So if we're going to use pi. But anyway, they suggest, what about the rim? Amar Papa, sfato sfat perach shoshan tivbe. It says that the rim was like the petal of a rose. Now, the petal of a rose is very thin, so it doesn't really count. How do we know this? Dichtiv, v'ovyo tefach usfato k'maseh kos perach shoshan, alpayim bat yachil, and it held 2,000 baht. We'll get to that later. The main point here is that it was very thin, and that's why it doesn't count. But then they say, va'i kamashu, but isn't there a little bit? So they say, oh, sorry, Shoshan is a lily. Anyway, they say, va'i kamashu, there's a little bit. Ki kachashiv mi gavai kachashiv. When they measured it, they talked about 10 from the rim to the rim, meaning from the outer rim to the outer rim, and not the inner rim, okay? Tanya. Now they say, here comes the interesting part. Rabbi Chia brought this braita. Yam she'asa Shlomo haya machzik 150 mikveh tahara. So they say it held 150 kosher mikvahs in it. Okay, it was 150 times the minimum amount required for a mikvah. So now they want to figure out how this calculation worked. What did this Yam Shel Shlomo look like? How did this work? Michte mikvah kama havu. Okay, and if you look on the sheet that I made today, it'll help you with the calculations. Okay, I kind of did all the calculations there so you could see how this works. So for those who math is, at your fingertips, this won't be so complicated. For those who it's a little more complicated, you'll see what's interesting is the way the rabbis, what I found fascinating about this is the way they tried to simplify mathematics for people. Now, again, either this was the way mathematics were done in their day, or they were just trying to simplify it for the average person. So how does it work? Michti mikvah kama have 40 se'ah. They're going to go step by step. One mikvah has 40 se'ah. That's the measurement of how much water is in a mikvah. How do we get to that? Keditanya. V'rachatz b'mayim epesaro b'mei mikvah. Okay, so they say b'mayim teaches you it has to be mei mikvah. Kol b'saro, what does it mean? All your body. So that teaches you, and this is the important part, mayim shakol gufo olevah. And it has to be all your body can fit in. How much is that going to be? V'kama hen, ama alama berum shalosh amo. 1 by 1 with a height of 3 amo. Okay, so how much is that going to be in terms of area? How much is in here or volume? We're going to have 1 times 1 times 3. So it basically 3 amo of cubic space inside. V'shiaru chachamim mei mikvah 40 se'ah kama havu. 40 se'ah, sorry, period. Okay, so now they say, and the rabbis assumed, how much can you fit into 3 cubic amot, 3 cubits? You could fit 40 se'ah. So that's the working assumption. 3 cubic amot equals 40 se'ah. So now we say, kama havalu. So how much was in this Yam Shel Shlomo? 500 garmide. There were 500 cubic cubits. How so? Remember, it was 10 by 10 with a depth of 5. Now, the tricky part here is the rabbis right now are talking about it as if it's a square. Okay, so imagine what's the cubic measurement? If it was a square, 10 by 10 is 100, times 5 height is 500. So we assume right now there's 500 cubic cubits in here, okay? So now, how do they split it up? If we start with our first measurement is 3 amot equals 4 se'ah. So now, if you want to get from 3 to 500, it's not actually divisible. So what's the simplest way to do it? Split 500 into things that are divisible by 3. 300 and then 150, okay? And then you can get to 50, right? So you kind of work in increments to make it simple. So they say, so let's figure this out. Litzlat mea, for 300, how many will that be? Well, if 3 is 1 mikvah's worth, then 300 is 100 mikvah's worth. Okay, that's simple mathematics. So that gets you to 100 mikvahs. Then you get to lemea chamishim. So now 300, split it into 2, you get to 150. So now we get up to 450. If you have 300 plus 150, you get up to 450. How much is that going to be? That will be chamishim. That will be lemea v'chamishim. Chamishim. Okay, 1 second. That will be 150. So now you have we have 300 is equal to 100 mikvah. 150 is equal to 50 mikvah. What's the problem? That already gets us up to 150. And our whole thing was that we want to get to 150, and they were up to 150, but we only are at 450. And this is 500. So that's what the Gemara is going to ask. So then they say, "Ba'arba me'ah v'chamishim sagya." We already got to 150. Sorry, I don't know why my connection's not so good. I plugged in the computer. It seems to have messed it up. Try to leave it unplugged, and hopefully it didn't. Okay. Is this better? So that gets us up to 450. So now, if we move up to 500, we're already going to have a problem. So what did they say? Right, then it's going to be more than 150, and he said it was 150. So now, what did we say? So michti kama meruba yeter ala igul. Oh, sorry, I skipped. Hanimile biribua. That would all be if it were a square, but we know it wasn't a square; it was round. Yam shasa shlomo agul haya. It was round. So michti kama meruba yeter ala igul revia. Okay, so now they say, okay, well, how much? This is also their calculation. How much larger is a square than a circle? By a quarter. Okay, basically it's going to be 3 parts of a circle equals, right, 1 more to get to the square. You add a third more, or right, the way you would calculate it, the way they always calculate it is from the outside. So basically a circle is 3/4 of a square. So now we want to use different measurements, because if we want something divisible by 4, we're not going to say 300 plus 150. We're going to say 400 and 100, because those are easily divisible by 4. So la'arba mea, so if you take 400 of those 500 cubits, mea, right, you're going to get to 400 is down to 300, because it's only a quarter will be the size of the square, a quarter less. So you have 300, which is going to be 100 mikvaot. Then lemea, you have another 100 we didn't deal with yet, because we said it was 500. That's going to go down to 75. 75 is how much? 25. How do you get to that? I did this on the sheet to make it easier for you. 75 is like 25, 25. 30, 30, and 15. And 30 is 10 mikvahs. So 30 plus 30 is 20 mikvahs, plus 5 is 5 mikvahs. Okay, so basically you get to 25. So basically we have now 125. Well, now we're too short, right? We started with, if it's a square, then it's going to be more than 150 mikvahs. And if it's now a circle, it's going to be 125 only, because here we got up to 500 and we were only at 125 mikvahs. So, so now we have a problem. So what's going to be the obvious answer? Well, if you look at the pictures, you'll see. Tane Rami Bar Yecheskel Yam Sha'asa Shlomo Shalosh Amot Tachtoniot Merubaot. The bottom 3 cubits were square. Okay, how does that work now? 300 square cubits at the bottom. That's going to be 100 mikvahs. And Shtayim Elyonot Agulot. The top 2 are circle. That's going to be 200, a quarter of 200, because it's right. If it was square, it would be 200. Quarter of that is 150, and 150 is going to equal 50 mikvahs. And that's how we get to it. So now, okay, and that's your picture. Picture number 106 is this Yam Shel Shlomo, which was square at the bottom and a circle at the top. Now the Gemara, until now, we've been under the working assumption that Rabbi Chia is right, that it's 150 mikvahs. Now we're going to question that and say, well, if it was started at square at the bottom and it went and became rounded at the top, so they say, Nihi de ibcha lo matzit amar dispato agul ktiv. I understand you can't switch it and say the bottom was round and the top was square, because what did it say in the pasuk? The rim was circular. But why wouldn't you say, okay, they're just suggestions. It's not like they have any reason to say this. Ela ema chada. Why don't you say maybe only 1 am at the top was a circle and 4 amot at the bottom, and then it had more than 150 mikvahs? So they say, lo salkadata, because we know exactly how much water was in there. How do we know? Because the pasuk said, I told you we get back to this, alpayim bat yachil. What is a bat? It has 2,000 bat. What is bat? Bat kama havya, shalosh se'ina. Bat is 30 se'ah. Dichtiv ma'aser habat min akor. It says in a different pasuk that a bat is a 10th of a kor. A kor is 30 se'ah. So if it's a 10th, it's 3 se'ah. And if it's 3, and there were 2,000 of them, then we end up with 2,000 times 3 is 6,000. So we know it was 6,000 bat. So it's 6,000 se'ah. 6,000 se'ah is 40 times 150. You get to 6,000. So we knew that the number was under 50 because of this. It's 6,000 measurements of a se'ah. But then they say, wait a minute, there's a different verse though that says, and we're at the end of our mathematics, if this is confusing you, says somewhere else that the Yam Shel Shlomo, this is in Divrei Hayamim. There's always contradictions between the versions in Malachim and Divrei Hayamim. In Divrei Hayamim, it said the Yam Shel Shlomo had 3,000, bat, which means it was even bigger. So what did the answer? Hahu legudsha. That was for the overflow. Okay, now water can't really overflow, but if you put solid in there, it would fit 3,000. And Amar Abai, Shma Mina, Hai Gudsha Tzlata Havi. We talk about this all the time. It comes up in many situations where we say the overflow of a utensil will be a third more, okay? And again, a third is always from the outside, meaning if it's 3,000, when it's totally full, take away a third and you get to what it would be like flat. And now they're going to have a Mishnah that proves this. Utna Nami, Shida Teva Umigdal, Kaveret Hakashu, Kaveret Hakanim, Ubor Svina Alexandri. These are all types of utensils that are usually large. Now, if a utensil is too large, okay, and the measurement is it holds 60, I think it's 60 se'ah when it's overfull, and flat 40, we're going to see is, it's 60. If it's so big, then it's already not a utensil. And if it's not a utensil, then it can't become impure. So all these things, even though they have a rim, if you put a liquid measurement, liquids can't overflow, right? They will overflow. They can't stay heaping. Then it will be 40, shehem kurayim biyavesh, which is 2 se'ah in dry measurements, tahorim. Then they'll be tahor because that's the same measurement. So here you see, that proves that. Okay, I want to end before we get to the next Mishnah with the Rambam on the Perush Mishnah, and I brought it on your sheet. So the Rambam says, Tzarich ata ladat, you need to know, sheyachas koter ha'igul lehekefo bilti yadua. People really don't know exactly what this measurement is. V'i efshar ledaber alav la'olam b'diuk, and you can't speak about it in exact measurements. Ve'en ze chisaron yedi'ah mitzidenu, kamo shechoshvim aschalim. It's not because we don't understand. Ela shedavar ze mitzad tib'o bilti noda. By its nature, it's not known. This is interesting the way he's talking about it. Ve'en b'mitziuto sheyivada. Okay, it's not going to be able to be found out. Aval efshar l'sha'aro b'kiruv. You can calculate it. You can get close to what the calculation is. And he says, the best of the engineers did chiburim, mathematical equations, and they had all sorts of proofs. And he basically says the one that they came up with is 3 1/7, which is close to pi, not exactly pi, 3 1/7. And then he says, this is what it is. Okay, the last line he says, okay, bekevan sheze lo yusag legamre, ela bekiruf tafso. And because it's so complicated, he says, what he's trying to say is what the rabbis were doing here, we're simplifying it. His approach, I gave kind of 2 approaches before. His approach is because it's such a complicated number and no one can really figure it out exactly, the rabbis wanted to just give it a simple explanation. And notice it's a sort of a, I don't know if you would say machmir, but it's to say, assume that the diameter is a little bit, right, that you would need a smaller, well, I guess here it would be makel to say it's really 1, right? It would be, no, it's a little larger, right? It's a little larger than it should be. So he's saying, that's what they're saying. It has to be a little bit larger. But in general, what they're saying is this is the shear the rabbi set. Anytime you need to figure out the diameter, just do it simply. Right? It's the rabbi's way of simplifying matters. That's the Rambam's approach to it. Okay, there's different approaches, and it's a very interesting topic about how much they really knew about mathematics or not. There's academic articles written about it. Anyway, we'll stop with that, and we'll continue on with the Mishnah. L'chayayin she'amru. Okay, when it comes to the lechi, govhan asarat tvachim v'rochban v'ovyan kolshehu. So how tall does the lechi need to be? Minimum 10 tvachim height. Remember, the beam didn't have any height because the beam doesn't need to be a certain height. It needs to be a certain width. Obviously, where you put it has to be within certain boundaries. But the lechi has to be a certain height, but not a certain width. Doesn't matter. Ovyan kolshehu. Rabbi Yossi, however, says, Rochban shlosha tvachim. It has to be 3 tvachim wide. So now the Gemara says, notice the wording in the Mishnah. The previous Mishnah said, the beam in singular. This one says, the posts in plural. So the Gemara says, L'chayayin shamru, lematnan stama ki Rabbi Eliezer. Do you want to say that this holds like Rabbi Eliezer, that you need 2 posts? Because it's saying the posts that you need as if you need multiple posts. So they say, no, they say, ki Rabbi Eliezer so do we think it's like Rabbi Eliezer? Damar l'chayayim b'inam. Remember his opinion, you need 2 posts. And they seem very strange that we would hold like Rabbi Eliezer and the Mishnah would go according to him.